Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation which we delivered at the Curry Club in London on November the 9th. Tim, who you will meet in a couple of slides' time, and myself wanted to bring to life some of the practical examples of how geographical information systems and services and remote sensing and space technology can improve the livelihoods and lives of smallholder farmers, for me in northern Uganda and Tim on a much broader and wider scale. So we will introduce ourselves and then get on and share some of these proper examples. So let's get on with it. So who am I? My name is Alison Hall. I'm a member of TAAI and I am the founder of Seeds for Development, a small charity working in northern Uganda, and our goal is to kick poverty out of northern Uganda through farming, education and enablement. So for farming, we provide seeds to farmers and also arrange for them to have training. For education, we support nursery schools in the villages where we work. And for enablement, we finance or fund training programs for the youth so they can find other ways to earn money instead of farming. I started the charity in 2007, and since then I've visited northern Uganda more than 30 times. We work in 7 villages in northern Uganda, around 2 key towns, Gulu and Kitgum. Gulu is actually a city now. There are 4 near Gulu and 3 near Kitgum. And this region was completely devastated by a war between 1986 and 2006. The war was between the government army and a rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army. And during this war, up to 2 million people were forced into camps for internally displaced people. And so we met the people around Gulu in 2008 when they were still living in the camps. In 2010, the government forced everybody still living in the camps to go home. The problem they had was that their homes had been completely destroyed during the war and they had nothing to go home to. So still today, all these years later, we are helping these communities rebuild their lives and their livelihoods after the war. Now, I run Seeds for Development in my spare time. My day job is actually as the marketing manager for a company called Alcis that provides geographical information systems to the international development community. And so I'm now going to hand over to Tim, who is going to introduce you to himself and also to Alcis before we carry on with the next part of our presentation. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Alison, and hello. My name's Tim Buckley and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Alcis. My background is in geographic information services, and I've been working in fragile and conflict affected states for over 25 years. First half of my career was in the British Army using geospatial intelligence to support defence, and the second half has been using those same techniques but to support international development and humanitarian work around the world. So Alcis is a geographic information services company. We've been around since 2004 when we started helping the British Embassy in Kabul work on counter-narcotics and rural agriculture. Since then, the company's expanded its geographic footprint of where we work, as shown on the dashboard here of where our projects are, and also the themes we work on. So we've expanded from counter-narcotics into rural development, into international development more generally, and humanitarian. But at all times we're using geographic information, remotely sensed imagery to understand what's going on and to enable decision makers and donors to make the most effective decisions to help some of the worst off people in the world. This slide is showing a selection of the logos of the different organisations that we've worked for over that almost 20-year engagement in fragile and conflict affected states. I'm sure you'll recognise many of them, and we also sit on a number of frameworks supporting international development work. So on this slide we're looking at how we actually do our work. So we use predominantly a combination of these 3 data inputs. We have satellite imagery at the top, which is the Earth observation element, and that allows us to see what is happening in different places. In the bottom right, we have geographic information, and this is data which is located in time and space, and it tells us where things are happening, or potentially how much something is happening or changing. And then the final element of the way we work is the bottom left side, where we're talking about field surveying. And this is an element that very few technology companies cover, but because of the work we do in the locations we do it, having people on the ground to collect data, to provide inputs to that understanding piece, and also to validate the results we get from doing the Earth observation analysis or the geographic information analysis is vitally important. I thought it would be useful to introduce some of the basic concepts that we use and that we talk about when we're talking about or using GIS and remote sensing. So its most fundamental point or principle is that everything on Earth happens somewhere, and we use the coordinate, the location of where things are happening, to tie different pieces of information together. And effectively what we're doing, we're building a digital picture that we're trying to represent every phenomena on the Earth's surface or even above the Earth's surface. And then once we've got all that data collected and in a common reference system, as you can see indicated by the animation on the right hand side, where we're layering up different elements of data, it allows us to see how disparate elements interact with each other, and then look for patterns in how those elements are distributed. And it was the work of a guy called John Snow back in the 1800s that really, obviously using paper maps, was fundamental in sort of some of these principles of using GIS to link different data, where he looked at the correlation between outbreaks of cholera and particular water pumps around London, and through that understanding from mapping the phenomena, he was able to establish the connection and then do something meaningful about it. The real power of GIS is in the sort of questions we can answer by applying analysis techniques to these different data layers. And so typical questions that we get asked are around how many people have been impacted, who's worst off, who needs the most help, or where do I do something in order to have the greatest effect. So using the recent example of the earthquakes, or there were 3 earthquakes in total that hit Western Afghanistan about a month ago, here's an example of how you can answer some of those questions by layering up different data. So on the map, what you see here are the shake zones, the different shake intensity zones, with the epicenter of the earthquake in the center of this dark purple blob here. Around it, in these different colors, the spots, these are domestic compounds. These are where people live. And then these red lines are representing the roads that traverse, or the primary roads that traverse the area. So the roads that could support movement of truck type traffic. And what we've done, we've buffered out a distance, I think, of perhaps 5 kilometers either side of the road. And that would be to remove any compounds in that area that were within 5 kilometers, so the easiest to reach people. And then what you're left with, and the points are highlighting here, are those individual compounds or communities that are furthest away from the road, so least likely to get the help, but are within these different shake intensity levels. So it's in fact these dark purple spots in here where we would expect the people to need the greatest help, but because of their remoteness, they're potentially not going to be recognized in the response effort. So to introduce remote sensing, all it is effectively measuring reflected energy from the Earth's surface, and that can either be, the energy can be sourced from the sun, and so you're measuring energy reflected from the sun, or it could be from a sensor like a radar sensor, which is beaming out energy and then measuring that return back up to the platform itself. So in this first example, we have you're looking at effectively a picture taken from space, a digital picture taken from space, and this is someone's compound in Afghanistan. You can see 3 solar panels there, you can see a water reservoir there, and then a number of crops around this household farm. And with field work and further imagery, we could then define what those crops were and look at how widespread they are, the area they covered. Next up is looking at a different part of that electromagnetic spectrum, again using sun as the source of the energy, is to look at the near infrared spectrum. This is a really useful application in farming and agriculture because it allows us to understand how healthy crops are, how leafy and green the crop mass is, and then we can do something about it, or we can tell what condition the crops are in. Very recently, a satellite was put up that can measure thermal energy reflected from the Earth's surface, and the image you're looking at on the screen here, this is the Las Vegas Strip, and it's been colorized. The reflected energy has been colorized to show hot objects in red and then colder objects in blue. So you can see the street layout clearly emitting quite a degree of energy, of heat, and then the main thoroughfare with all its lights and hotness shown there. Next up, SAR, or synthetic aperture radar. This is, as I mentioned before, a radar sensor, beams out energy and measures how it is returned to the satellite. And this is really good for looking at hard angular objects, a really effective way of seeing ships in the ocean, for instance, and other factors that sort of reflect or distort the reflected waves in particular ways. Further sensor, or a further part of the spectrum that can be analysed, is in using a hyperspectral sensor. So this cuts down the waveband into tiny little segments, and this is really useful for mineral mapping particularly. So this is an open cast mine somewhere, I think in Australia, and the different minerals that are being mined there show up and have been colorized because of the way their energy is reflected. And then the final one, which is slightly covered possibly by my speaking head, is LiDAR data. So this is laser scanning. Gets used frequently on building sites, but this is a laser scanner in an aircraft, and that measures the return signal of a laser beam pinged down onto the Earth, and that gives us a 3D model, a really effective and quick way of developing 3D models. And that's a quick intro to the different types of sensors that are available and how they work. In our work, what we do, depending on the question we're being asked or the application we're looking at, we will pick the right mix of those sensors, as say, integrate it with field work, integrate it with other geographic data to build that comprehensive understanding. And my final slide on some of these fundamental principles is one of the really helpful things about using remotely sensed data is that there is often a longitudinal archive that will have captured data over somewhere you're interested in back in time. And so it allows us to do retrospective analysis to see how things have changed over time. And in this instance, this is back to that earthquake in Afghanistan from last month. We've got a community here which we can see in an image on the 22nd of September, and you can see, or if you was zoomed in further, you could see in detail that these structures, these houses were all standing. Then the image from the 11th of October, immediately the day after the second earthquake in the area, and what you can see is a lot of destruction of these houses, which stands out really clearly. And then what one of my analysts has done is actually circle all these black objects that are circled in the image here are tents, and then these white objects that have been circled down here are tents given out by aid organizations. So in this community, this is a semi-nomadic community that use these buildings. These black tents are their traditional traveling tents. But we know that aid has reached them because we've got this alignment of white tents distributed by the aid agency. So we can tell quite a bit about the communities that's there, the fact they've been reached by first responders, and that the scale of devastation was very intense there. So yeah, making use of that change analysis is a very common technique that we do at Alcis.
Thank you, Tim. That was amazing. I'm now going to bring you back to northern Uganda and down to earth with a bump. I'd like to talk now a bit about food security and the challenges that people are facing, not just in the villages we support, but across the whole developing world. So when COVID hit and the lockdown came in, it just added to the woes of the people caused by climate change and conflict, not just the conflict in northern Uganda, but the conflict in Ukraine. So the government locked down the country and everyone sold whatever they had and used their savings to buy food and stock up. But the lockdown carried on, and so they were forced then to eat the seeds that they had saved for the next season. And still the lockdown continued. This then meant that people were forced to eat grass and wild plants. When finally the lockdown ended, the people in northern Uganda emerged with absolutely nothing, and it's had a devastating effect. This is one of the people that we have been supporting with emergency food handouts. His name is Oriam Elisio, and he is 86 years old. And every day during the season when the mangoes are ripening on the trees, he sits under his mango tree and he waits for the mangoes to drop. And then when they drop, he peels them and he eats them. And that's all he eats all day. When the mango season ends, he doesn't have any food. And that's our signal for us to start handing out our emergency food parcels to him and to hundreds of other people in the communities. In 2021, the first year we had to do this, we distributed food once to about 200 people. Last year in 22, it was twice to around 300 people. And this year, around 500 people have had to have food delivered to them 3 times. For the first 2 years, we didn't really track or monitor who was receiving any food. But now, thanks to this amazing technology, GIS or geospatial, we have been able to look and find the people and then locate them on the map. So the farmers, one in each village, have got a smartphone which we've loaded a survey on. It's an online survey called Survey 123, and they go around and every time they hand food out, they take a photograph of the person receiving it, and they also note the location of where it is. And you can see all of these little red dots show the locations of the people who have been receiving food. And here is our man from under the mango tree with his food. And food is a bit of an exaggeration, really. It's like fuel. It's 10 kilos of maize that is delivered in the plastic bag, which is just by his elbow. But it means that we can now see who has received food, when they've received food, and it really is transforming how we do our emergency food distribution. All of that data that we have collected is then brought together and presented on this dashboard, which was made by my colleague Helen at Alcis, and it's really brilliant. So you can see in the circles, these are like the clusters of vulnerable people receiving the food, and the number of dots. If there's 1 dot, it means they receive food once, 2 dots twice, 3 dots 3 times. So obviously those who have received food once, that's much better. And so they're not nearly as vulnerable as the others who've needed it 3 times. But on this dashboard, everything's brought together and you can see it across the 7 villages we support, or I can go right in to each individual village and see where they are. And you can see here, we're in a place called Parabongo, and on the left hand side you can see that there are, it says 122 vulnerables. These are not the people, these are the numbers of food handouts that we did. So each dot will be recorded as a vulnerable. Probably the naming isn't too great, but you get an idea of what we're doing and how we're locating all of the people who we are helping stop being hungry. As well as mapping where the people are who receive our food, we're also going out and mapping all the crops that are being grown. And what you can see here is the dashboard that shows all of the locations that we're working in. And then you can see that there are 738 farmers supported by Seeds for Development. We've mapped 1,547 different fields growing these different crops. And it's absolutely brilliant that we can see who is growing what and also see where our seeds are being grown. Going into a bit more detail now, this is Devon. He's one of our community leaders, and here he is with his smartphone loaded up, and he is out, and you can see here that he has recorded a field of rice, and you will know that this is rice. I didn't. I thought it was grass, but I was told that rice stands up straight, whereas grass just bends over. But there's a reason for us wanting to record all of the rice, especially in this village, Otichi, which is the one that is the furthest away from Gulu. And let me tell you why. So the reason why I was very interested in the rice is because in Otichi, the farmers there are the hardest working, I think, out of all of them. All of the hundreds that we support today and up to thousands that we've supported over the years. But Otichi were recognised by the Ministry of Agriculture for their really, really hard work. And the Ministry of Agriculture built them this store. All that's needed now for it to be finished is a gate, which is always helpful. But they're really proud of it, and it's going to transform their farming as a business efforts because, as you will see on the next slide, inside the store is a rice hulling machine. And so this came with the store. And so the farmers who have got rice can now bring it to this store where they can hull it and store it until the price in the market goes up because the supply is going down. So we gave some of the parents of the children in the nursery school we support rice. And so we can now map where they are growing the rice and also which other farmers are growing rice. So we can start to predict and plan how many of them will be bringing their rice to the store, what the end product will be and how much we'll have, and then see if we can help them sell that at a good price in the local market or arrange for transport to go further afield. So all of this is done using GIS, something I never imagined we'd be doing, even a year ago. And I can feel it and see it, that it's going to be the future for us in really accelerating the development of the farmers. And with that, I'll hand back to Tim. Thank you.
So building on Alison's work in Uganda, which is taking place at that very local level, something we do a lot at in Alcis is then scale that up and look at building national level data sets and understanding. And one of the countries where we've done that a lot, looking at the different crops, is Afghanistan. And I'm sure you'll appreciate in the last 2 and a bit years, Afghanistan's undergone a significant change politically, economically and environmentally, although the environmental side is less talked about. But the net result of all those changes, the Taliban coming to power, the crackdown on the production of opium that took place in the country, and the increasing levels of drought and unreliability of water in the country has led to a situation where more and more people are at greater risk of hunger and extreme poverty. And so one of our clients, approached us and asked us to start looking at food security issues within the country. And part of that work was to build a crop map across the entire country, looking at that first cycle, so the crops that get harvested between about late May, early June, and sort of in some places, mountainous places, up into sort of August period, that cropping cycle extends. And what we did was take national level or national coverage of remote sense data imagery, and then start to classify the different crop types that we saw. into one of 5 classes. So wheat, poppy, orchards and vineyards, and then all other crops fell into a category we called other. And this was the picture we produced in 2022. And if from the colour scheme, you've got wheat as the predominant crop through the Helmand Valley. This is Helmand province in the south of Afghanistan. You'll be possibly familiar with Kajaki Reservoir up here. Yeah, so this is central Helmand down the river, and you've got this irrigated canal command area over here. And all of this purple or pinky purple is poppy, fields and fields of poppy that the farmers would grow, with a little bit of orchard and vineyard, particularly over this is Kandahar over here, lots of vineyards in the western end of Kandahar. And so that was the picture in 2022. And then the Taliban imposed a ban on the cultivation of opium, and we ended up with a picture that looks like this. So you'll notice that all of the pinks that were out in the sort of these peripheral areas, excuse me, a huge area of the country, and particularly in Helmand, it was it's such a significant crop, the opium crop there, had disappeared. So the ban was highly effective. 95% reduction in cultivation in Helmand province. I mean, this is staggering. It became world news. It was world news when we broke the story with our data, and we showed that the Taliban had held true to their ideal of banning the cultivation of opium in the country. This is a zoom in using that field by field crop analysis that we did into an area in the northeast of the country, a province called Badakhshan, highly mountainous, quite remote, hard to get into, hard to access, and cut off a lot of the time in the winter because of the snows. And what we saw there, that although the Taliban ban on cultivation was widely adopted across the entire country, Badakhshan actually increased its production. I mean, market dynamics meant that the time of planting opium or poppy prices, opium prices were about 6 times higher than their normal point. So there was a big economic incentive because of the ban. And in Badakhshan, as you can see in the example here, these fields that we've outlined, they were created or captured from the data, showing where they were still persisting and growing poppy. So this is a really useful proxy for not just understanding the agricultural conditions, but also some of the power dynamics and the influence and the coercive power of the Taliban, where it can penetrate and where it can't penetrate, and potentially how that will manifest itself in time, as we see if they enforce a ban in 2024, and what that will mean for the country and for the security and stability of the regime as it currently exists. So not only can we look at what is being grown in an individual field, we can also look at how that is changing over time. The GIF on the right hand side of the screen there is showing the expansion of agriculture and the growth of agriculture, moving from this boundary formed by the main irrigation canal through Helmand, and the traditional agricultural area this side of it, and then over the years seeing how agriculture expands out from the canal out into the desert. And the graph at the bottom, which again is slightly obscured by me, is showing the area of agriculture and also the quality of the agriculture. So the brighter the colours that you start to see fill in here, the higher quality that agriculture is. And what was really interesting is that this was an expansion that was driven predominantly by technology. Initially, farmers would drill a borehole down the aquifer, and with a diesel-powered pump, would pump water up from the aquifer, store it in a holding reservoir, and then would flood irrigate their crops. And then what really drove this massive growth in around about 2010 was the arrival in this part of the world of very cheap Chinese-made solar panels. And so now the farmers could switch from diesel-powered pumps to solar-powered pumps, and effectively it made the constant abstraction of water from the aquifer free. And this led to, or resulted in, around about 103,000 reservoirs and associated farms in this area, and a million new hectares of agriculture. So huge increase in agricultural productivity, and it was effectively turning the desert green. What I'm going to do on the next couple of slides is try and illustrate what that expansion looked like and give you a sense of the scale of it. So we're looking at, we're zoomed right in. This is a bit of satellite imagery. You've got a river running down here. You can see these vehicle tracks to give you a bit of a sense of scale. And this area is approximately 500 meters by 800 meters. And in 2014, there was nothing to see there other than some vehicle tracks. Fast forward 8 years, and that area has now been filled in with all these farms, all these fields, these houses, household farms. Lots of, you can see the solar panels, you can see the reservoirs in each of these cases, and we've got about 24 farms in that area. And then if I zoom out from, that was the little blue box we were just looking at in detail. So zooming now out to a greater level, so we're now looking at about a 30 kilometre by 20 kilometre box. This is the main Helmand River running down the south here. And you can see in 2014, very little agriculture going on across this entire area. A bit of existing agriculture along these tributaries into the main river. But again, 8 years later, just look at it, full of farms, households, growing crops across the area. So, you know, in some respects, this is really positive. It's allowing people to settle on land and to grow productive crops, to grow an income. The concern, though, is how sustainable is this? So we're now zoomed right out. Here's Helmand. That little bit we were looking at was just up there. So here's the whole Helmand River. This is Kandahar and the Arghandab River coming in here. And over time, between 2016 to 2022, we've seen this increase up to around about just over 100,000 reservoirs across the area. But what we hear anecdotally from the farms on the ground is that they're having to drill deeper and deeper in order to reach the water in the reservoir, in the aquifers. And in some places, particularly this area over here, we've heard about some of these farms that are set up within the last 10 years are now shutting down, and the people are moving away because they can no longer draw the water up and use it. So we've got localized stresses because of that lack of water. We're seeing those. We're also seeing conflict down on the Pakistan Afghan border and on the Iranian-Afghan border. There's been conflict. There's been lives have been lost in fighting driven by access to the water, and so yeah, these are very serious issues. And you know, critically, if the water levels continue to drop and these people, these 310 households, each with between maybe 10 and 20 people living there, if it no longer becomes viable to farm this land, what will happen to those people? Where are they going to go when that water runs out? So sticking with the theme of agriculture, but moving over to Ukraine and the impact that the conflict has been having there on agriculture. We're working for the UK government on a project there. And this is some analysis we did quite recently, looking at the impact of the conflict on the quality of agriculture. So in this image on the left-hand side, taken in July 2021, before the invasion and the conflict, you can see an awful lot of agriculture. What are we looking at? Almost 14,000 square kilometres of active agriculture, with values, these 0.7, the yellow being very high NDVI. So this is really good, productive agriculture. You can see some of these drip irrigation feeders, these circular feeders. Then move forward to July 2022. So the conflict has been going 5 months by this stage. And look at the picture we see now. So not only is there a massive change in colour, so the values of the NDVI are much reduced, down at the sort of 0.3 to 0.2, which is almost, peripheral of no agriculture, no productive vegetation. But we've also got this huge drop in area. So not only was much less land planted, but actually it's performing significantly worse. And that could be a factor caused by perhaps lack of fertilizer, lack of good farming husbandry, or potentially a lack of water coming down to some of the irrigation canals that drop off the river here. So I think a really stark illustration of the impact of the conflict, but it's a really good illustration of what we can do with remotely sensed data without having to put people on the ground. Here's another example of some of our work in Ukraine, looking at the impact of the destruction of the Kharkovka Dam that occurred earlier this year. So we've got an image from June 2022 on the left-hand side. This is what we could consider the normal picture. And these are these coloured lines are canals that flow off that reservoir and irrigate the agriculture down there. And then we look at the picture in June 2023 when the dam was blown, and you can see the huge impact on the water level. So this was a lake previously. Now water is just about running through these small channels through this large area that would have been lake. So water is no longer coming down, particularly this blue canal or the orange canal here. Some water is going into the green canal here and then going down into the sort of the sub canals and irrigating some of the crops. But yeah, significant impact caused by the destruction of that dam that will have on the availability of water in this area. So in this next example, we're going to jump back to Afghanistan and we're going to continue looking at food security or food insecurity. And we were approached by one of the organisations that work there, one of the donors, to help provide insight on the situation so they could implement as effective a response as possible. So as I described earlier, the situation in the country is getting worse. The agencies that work there have fewer people on the ground and less capacity, less money as well, less resources to support the local population. And so with that in mind, as I talked about right at the beginning and why GIS is so useful, what we can do is bring data together and highlight those areas that are at greatest risk, and therefore help prioritize where food distribution points in this instance should be located. So to build up the understanding and the data to inform that decision making, we looked at 4 principal areas: community risk, household risk, agricultural risk, and meteorological risk. And I'll briefly touch on each one in the next few slides and explain how we brought the data together. So the community risk layer is a data set we create annually across the country, and it builds on the principles I was talking about at the beginning of the slideshow, where we're layering up different input data types. And it's driven by geospatial data, and we're bringing into the sum things such as the quality of the agriculture, the consistency of the performance of that agriculture. We look at where services are available, be that things like medical, schooling, education, government services. We look at where markets are, agricultural markets, and how frequent they are. We also look at the stability of the power supply, which is another important factor in understanding how people's livelihoods are made up. So we layer all those different data layers together. In all, there's about 120 representing those factors that we talked about. And where you get a number of positive factors all occurring in the same space, you end up with a high score. And when you have lower scoring factors occurring in the same space, you end up with a low score. And so this gives you a map like this, which is quite nuanced, with the darkest purple areas being the most well-off areas, through to the oranges and the yellows, which are the least well-off areas. And so that's our first layer in this understanding. Second piece that we bring in to build this picture of overall risk is household risk. And this again is a data set that is worked on annually. It's driven this time by field surveys, so researchers going out into communities on the ground and conducting a number of surveys, collecting data with paper forms, or perhaps if we're lucky on smartphones, and that data all coming back to us, where we analyze it and map it, showing where each community was and the scores and answers they gave. And so we end up with a laydown like this. So after those first two elements, which, as I said, were produced annually, we now get down to data that is much more time sensitive. And the first piece is the Agricultural Risk Index. So this is something that we compute on a 2-weekly basis, derived from remotely sensed data that's looking at the crop health. And what we're doing is assessing the crop health now and comparing the current conditions to the long-term average for that same time period over the last 8 years, excluding drought years. So we have a long-term average, we have the current conditions, and then we look at how far different they are, and so the scale of the deviation. But equally importantly, we look at how long they've been, how long that deviation has been going on for. So if it's only a 2-week blip and values are slightly low, it's not such a big deal. If they've been consistently low or behind normal, and it's been going on for perhaps 2 months, then this would start to flag alarm bells for us. And then the second and final time-sensitive piece of data is the meteorological risk index, that again we're calculating fortnightly. And in the same way, it's measuring scale of deviation, how far it is from a long-term average, and also the duration of that deviation from the long-term average. And there we're typically or throughout the year, we're looking at temperature, growing degree days, and the amount of precipitation. And during the winter months, we also build in snow cover and snow water equivalent, the amount of water that's held in the snowpack, as factors measure how the conditions are at that point in time. And then those four input layers, those four sort of discrete risk layers, are then squeezed together to give a picture like this that you see on the right hand side of the screen there, what we're calling the composite risk index. And this is then presented in a platform, as you see here, so people can query individual provinces, individual districts. They can look at the composite risk within a district. They can see where those established food distribution points are, and they can also see how many people are within the catchment of each food distribution point. So we're then able to highlight where the greatest risk is, which food distribution points are affected by that greatest risk, and how many people are reliant on each food distribution point. So we're able to give that information and provide that really granular insight to the client, which then will allow them to prioritize which distribution points they go to support when resources are so reduced. So in my final example, we're going to jump out of Afghanistan and into the Gambia and a project we worked on there, and using a technology that Alison mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and some of the work she's using at the local level in seeds, we're using similar technology but nationally. And this is these smartphone-based surveys, and it's a really useful tool, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with answering a questionnaire on our phone. It's commonly used for data collection everywhere we go, and there'll be a form with multiple answers that you can put in and multiple choice, and you can put measurements in and these kind of things. But the communities we were working in the Gambia, their sophistication was lower, and so what we did, we worked with the company that makes the survey tool, and we asked them to move away from a text-based question and answer method to a picture-based question and answer method. So, and we also took out a number of the intermediary steps. So what we could do now is the community could, in two clicks, report a fault with some of the equipment that they've been either been loaned or that have been built in their village. This project was looking to try and make services out in these rural communities better, so the population wasn't inclined to move to the bigger cities, and so they were given access to electrical power, water. There was road building work going on, and livestock and tractors were being distributed. And so with this technology, if there was a fault with it, with any of those pieces of equipment, they could report it very quickly and easily, then flashed up on a system at the government, who could then dispatch people out to go and repair the problem. So part of that project, along with the infrastructure upgrades that were being performed, was the loaning of labour-saving devices like these tractors to these communities. They could use them to plough the fields and do sort of good farming activity. But understandably, a tractor is a very valuable commodity, and under the arrangements that were in place, the communities that they were given to committed to use them for the purposes they were intended. So as part of the project, we were asked to monitor how the tractors were being used and which tractors were being used to ensure that they were getting the use they were intended to do. And so we put GPS tracking devices on each tractor, which allowed us to see this information. As soon as the tractor started moving, the GPS came to life and started pinging a message back that we could then look at. And you can see by these little halos on the map where the different tractors were located. And then you can see this incredibly bright hotspot, which means there's a big density of points in this place for one particular community. So this raised some flags, and we took a close look at the data. And here we have the data from all the tracking devices. The green bars tell you how many days they've been active and moving, and the red line is how many miles they've travelled from, how many kilometres they've travelled in that month. And so all looks well. And then you've got this community here, which is doing about 600 kilometres in the month on the 17 days it's active. So that's about 6 times higher than the normal mileage per day on here. So we took a closer look, and we plotted the GPS points onto a map, and here's where that community is, and where the tractor clearly was spending a lot of its time, but not all of its time, because it would then trundle off up here and up towards the river. You can see the river is just to the sort of north of the slide here, so it comes around here. And it was sort of getting up some stuff up here on the banks of the river. This is what we saw when we drilled in deeper still to the satellite imagery of where this tractor was going. So this is the side of the river here. You can see the river type environment here, some channels. And we've got these curious objects or features that we can see in the image. Now, they could be scrapes where something's been quarried out or mined out. It could be aggregates or sand being taken away for building. Could be ponds for supporting fish farms or something of that nature, or it could be something completely different. I'm not entirely sure. I'd love to know what they are, because I'm quite curious about this. But regardless, we sent this information on to the authorities, who had loaned the equipment and allowed them to investigate further and confirm this was in the scope of the project's usage.
Well, that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for watching it right to the end, which you must have done if you're still here. Tim and I hope that we have demonstrated, for me from at the village level, and for Tim at that national and regional level, the art of the possible of what can be done using this amazing technology. Of course, we'd love to answer your questions and hear any feedback or suggestions from you, and our email addresses and websites are here on the screen. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you at the next Curry Club. Bye for now.